This is pretty amazing. I'm going to talk about FEMA and the difference that if there's any agency that we can speak of in the U.S. government that seems to be more indicative of the philosophical implications of the Republicans and the Democrats. If there is one that is more indicative than FEMA, I'm not sure I know what it is. Because to a large extent, regulatory creep has affected a lot of agencies. And right now, I hear that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is one of the best, basically because it's so new. And in the way that Elizabeth Warren set it up. But FEMA is also one of those agencies where we can see the real difference between Democrats and Republicans. Now, let's just start with Obama and Romney. We know that Obama has called for cuts in FEMA by 3% in his budget, proposed budget. It would reduce 3% overall funding by 3% with $1 billion trimmed from the disaster relief fund, but more money given to state and local programs. So it cuts some, but it also gives to state and local programs to augment it. We don't know for sure how much Mitt Romney wants to cut from FEMA because he doesn't give specifics in his budget, but we do know that based upon how much he wants to cut from discretionary spending, that unless he particularly spares FEMA, FEMA is looking at a 40% cut. We also know what he said in the Republican primary debates about FEMA. Listen to this.
Governor Romney, you've been a chief executive of state. I was just in Joplin, Missouri. I've been in Mississippi and Louisiana and Tennessee and other communities dealing with whether it's the tornadoes, the flooding, and worse. FEMA's about to run out of money, and there are some people who say do it on a case-by-case basis, and some people who say, you know, maybe we're learning a lesson here that the states should take on more of this role. How do you deal with something like that?
Absolutely. Every time you have an occasion to take something from the federal government and send it back to the states, that's the right direction. And if you can go even further and send it back to the private sector, that's even better. Instead of thinking in the federal budget what we should cut, we should ask ourselves the opposite question. What should we keep? We should take all of what we're doing at the federal level and say, what are the things we're doing that we don't have to do? And those things we got to stop doing because we're borrowing $1.6 trillion more this year than we're taking in.
Including disaster relief.
We cannot afford to do those things without jeopardizing the future for our kids. It is simply immoral, in my view, for us to continue to rack up larger and larger debts and pass them on to our kids, knowing full well that we'll all be dead and gone before it's paid off. Makes no sense at all.
Well, aside from the fact that our deficit is actually lower this year than it was in 2009 or projected for 2009. Remember, that was Republican fiscal responsibility. But aside from that, because I don't think our deficit is really that much of an emergency or a moral case. I think you can make a moral case that it is immoral for us not to borrow at the lowest lending rates that are possible to invest in the future when we clearly need to and to get people jobs. But leaving that aside, what Romney is suggesting is that we defund FEMA and either give the money to states or privatize it. Let's start with give money to the states. We know that states have to balance their budgets because most of them have constitutions to do so because they don't have the flexibility of printing their own money. How many people think New Jersey, which has consistently underfunded their pension accounts to give tax breaks to rich people, how many people think they're going to have a big rainy day fund to salvage the disaster that is New Jersey? We just heard Michael Tracy on the program give us a live report from there. How many people think there'll be money there? How many people think there would be money in Louisiana, in Mississippi? How many people do you think would have predicted that we would get a hurricane of this size? I would put it somewhere around the neighborhood of 0. Now, I don't know if Mitt Romney would actually cut 40% of FEMA like his budget would suggest, but ideologically, I would imagine he wouldn't return the money to the states because he knows it would be gone. He would privatize it. We saw what privatization did. In the case of buses being sent to New Orleans, the responsibility to send those buses to New Orleans was privatized. It was sent out to a contractor who subcontracted it to another entity that had buses about 300 miles away. A government agency, like we saw with Obama leading up to this election, they were out in front of this. Michael Bloomberg was out in front of this. They want to save money, but they're willing to spend some just in case. And I'll tell you who's not willing to do that. Private companies. So these private companies that were subcontracted to send buses to New Orleans waited to the last possible minute because they didn't want to waste any money and cut into their profits. And by the time they had to send the buses, it was too late. What is job number one of a company that is subcontracted to provide disaster relief or disaster prevention? It is making profits. The exact same job number one as the guy selling cars down the street, the exact same job number one as the guy who sits in one of these financial buildings down on Wall Street. It is to make profits. And they will only deviate from that to the extent that making profits maybe in some way will cut in to their ability to make future profits. But that's a far murkier and less accountable area, isn't it? And it's really no solace if you're one of those people who couldn't get on a bus to get out of New Orleans or any other thing that you're relying on these private entities to do. We learned the lesson in New York when we privatized all the snow plowing. We tried to cut corners. That first snowstorm we had around this time last year, Bloomberg learned his lesson. But that is the Mitt Romney Republican vision for the future. As corporatized as both parties have become, there is a difference. There is a difference.